The doorbell rang 3 times in rapid succession, each chime sharper than the last. I set down my glass of wine and the quarterly reports, already knowing who stood on my porch. Through the study window, I caught the gleam of their white Tesla under the security lights. My daughter Claire only rang like that when she needed money. I walked through the marble foyer, past photographs that suddenly felt like relics from someone else's life. Claire at 5, missing her front teeth. Claire at 18, graduation day. Claire at 28, radiant in white. Every image now felt like a small betrayal I hadn't seen coming. She stood there with that practiced smile, the one that never reached her eyes anymore. Derek loomed behind her, scrolling his phone with the intensity of a man checking stock prices. Neither looked happy to be there. "Mom," Claire threw her arms around me, holding on a beat too long, like she was depositing emotional currency for later withdrawal. Derek brushed past without a word, heading straight for my armchair, my chair. I followed them into the living room. Derek had already spread documents across my coffee table like he was running a board meeting. Claire perched on the couch, fingers finding the pearl necklace I'd given her at 30. She always touched it when she was about to ask for something. "Let's cut to the chase, Diane." Derek didn't even look up. Not Mom, not Mrs. Whitfield, Diane, like I was a stranger he was negotiating with. "We wouldn't come unless it was necessary," Claire said, voice pitching higher. "You've always said family comes first. What happened to the property in Cedar Falls?" I kept my tone even, though my jaw had already begun its familiar clench. "Market correction. Temporary setback, that's not why we're here." Derek finally met my eyes. "We need $500,000 in our account by noon tomorrow." The room seemed to tilt. "Not 50,000. Not 100, $500,000 delivered as casually as a takeout order." I thought of teaching Claire to ride a bike, of walking her down the aisle, of every dollar I'd already quietly poured into her life. The wedding, the down payment, the tuition. The one-time bailout for Derek's failed ventures. Over the years, it added up to more than $1 million, and still they came back for more. "These aren't bank people we're dealing with," Derek said, pouring himself 3 fingers of my scotch without asking. "Serious individuals wouldn't want this to affect your reputation. Or the business." The threat hung there, obvious and nauseating. My blood pressure spiked, the migraine I got under stress already blooming behind my left eye. Then Claire said the words that changed everything. "If Dad were still alive, he'd be ashamed of how you're treating us." I felt something in me go very still. Her father had been dead 11 years, and she'd never once weaponized his memory before Derek came along. "Your father," I said slowly, "would have told you to get jobs." Derek laughed from the bar. "I'm an entrepreneur. I create jobs." 3 failed startups in 5 years, and I'd funded everyone, watching the money vanish into his delusions. I asked what the money was actually for. "Real estate," Derek said, "time-sensitive opportunity." But he'd just told me they lost money on real estate. He caught himself, corrected, cryptocurrency, a sure thing. The same lie that had already cost them $200,000 8 months earlier. I listed it all out loud, the wedding, the down payment, the startups, one after another until Derek cut me off, standing to use his height against me. "We're talking about your grandchildren's future. The grandchildren whose tuition I paid directly to their school." I looked at my daughter, a stranger wearing my daughter's face, and at her husband who'd never pretended to be anything but a parasite. "Fine," I said, flat and exhausted. "Tomorrow." "Now leave." Claire mistook my exhaustion for surrender. She reached for another hug. I let her arms fall empty. They left without another word, Derek's hand possessive on her back like she was a chip he'd already won. I waited 5 minutes after their taillights vanished before I made the first call. My attorney, Grace Ockhaffer, picked up on the second ring despite the hour. 20 years of friendship meant she knew my patterns. I never called after 9 unless something had finally broken. "They crossed the line, didn't they? Noon tomorrow, like I'm an ATM with a withdrawal limit they finally exceeded." "The house transfer paperwork is already filed," Grace said. "They just don't know it yet. Claire's name was never on that deed. You insisted on keeping it in your name when you covered their down payment." That was true. 5 years ago, quietly, patiently, I'd started protecting myself, hoping I'd never actually need to use any of it. I opened my laptop to an email I'd been sitting on for 3 weeks. A reservation for a small rental house on the coast of Portugal, dates already confirmed. What had been a retirement fantasy would now serve a different purpose. I rebooked the morning flight, first class, one passenger, 6:45 a.m. My home safe held 20 years of documentation, organized with a lawyer's precision. Every check, every wire transfer, every final loan. Derek signed promise from 2 years earlier, swearing this request would be the last. Claire's social media posts, printed and dated, showing champagne dinners while she claimed poverty to my face. Photographs of Derek at the casino, timestamps clear, losses written across his face. Security footage from the cameras I'd installed after a break-in years ago. Footage that had just captured every word of tonight's performance. I packed 2 suitcases, sent a 2-line email to my business partner, family emergency, you're in charge, and stood a long moment in front of a family portrait from 5 years back. Claire's smile had looked genuine then. I lifted the frame off the wall, turned it backward, and rehung it. The blank canvas felt more honest. I called my ex-husband's sister, Rosalind, in Savannah, the closest thing Claire had to another parent who'd tell her the truth. She answered like she'd been waiting. Grace called me. Are you really doing this? Should have done it years ago. She's your daughter. She's not the daughter I raised anymore. By 11:30, I stood in my dark kitchen studying my grandchildren's. Crayon drawings on the fridge, stick figures labeled Grandma and me fishing. I folded the fishing picture into my wallet. The children weren't responsible for their parents' choices. I set a plain cardboard box on the porch table, the kind that would draw no attention until they opened it. Inside, the deed, the loan history, nearly $1 million over 8 years, documented to the penny, the legal notices Grace had prepared months earlier, and a single note on top. You wanted it tomorrow, here's what you're really getting. The alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., no hesitation, no snooze. By 6, I'd signed a limited power of attorney at Grace's office, watched Crisp with donuts on the table, our tradition since 1999. The house transfer, she told me, had actually been executed the afternoon before, 3 hours before Claire even arrived to demand money. While my daughter drove over to threaten me, she'd already lost the biggest asset she thought she owned. By 7, I was airborne, watching Savannah fall away beneath the clouds. Rosalind had bought a place near mine months earlier without telling me. Insurance, she called it, in case I ever needed someone close by who wasn't Claire. I learned what happened next the way I learned most things about my daughter's life from then on second hand, through documentation, like watching a film I could no longer turn off. At noon exactly, the first credit card decline hit, Claire's coffee order at a downtown cafe, the last purchase she'd ever make on my dime. My neighbor called Grace at 12:15. They were at the house going through the box on the porch. The footage showed Claire's face changing like time-lapse photography, confusion, disbelief, horror, as she pulled out the deed, then the spreadsheet totaling nearly $1 million. Then the photographs of Derek at the casino, then her own voice on a flash drive. Just take whatever she gives us. She's too pathetic to say no. Derek threw his briefcase at my door hard enough to break the handle. Claire collapsed on the steps, sobbing not the rehearsed tears from the night before, but something raw, the sound of someone realizing she'd played herself. Over the following days, it unraveled fast. Derek's gambling debts surfaced, $500,000 owed to people who didn't send polite reminders. He vanished within a week, resurfacing months later working under an assumed name across the border, divorce papers filed in absentia. Claire's search history, visible through my old account, told its own story. Can mother take back a gifted house? Statute of limitations on financial gifts. Emergency bankruptcy lawyer. 4 attorneys gave her the same answer. Ironclad, nothing to reclaim. She lost the condo by mid-May, moved into a 400-square-foot studio above a diner, working retail by day and diner shifts by night. I watched all of this from a distance, through Grace's careful reports, feeling less triumphant than I expected. Mostly I just felt tired and finally quietly free. Rosalind and I settled into a rhythm neither of us had known in years. Mornings on the beach, terrible amateur watercolors she insisted on painting. Dinners of simple grilled fish instead of country club plates. My blood pressure dropped 30 points in 2 months. I stopped thinking about Claire's calls, then noticed I'd stopped flinching at her name entirely. In June, a letter arrived from her, forwarded through Grace. 3 pages, careful handwriting I hadn't seen since her college years. She wrote about a night shift at the diner, a table of her old sorority friends walking in, one of them recognizing her. She hadn't run. She'd taken their order. "I hated you when you left," she wrote. "I mean really hated you. Now I understand you didn't abandon me, you freed me from who I was becoming. Derek was my mirror." We were feeding off each other's entitlement, and when the money disappeared, we had nothing real underneath it. I wrote back one letter of my own, the only one I sent. I told her about a little girl on the beach who reminded me of her at 7, fearless and grateful, which Claire hadn't been in a long time. I told her I didn't blame her entirely. I'd created the conditions for who she became, writing checks instead of teaching consequences. I told her the trust fund I'd quietly set up years ago, the one she didn't know about, would mature when she turned 35, not as rescue, but as proof, one way or another, of who she'd chosen to become by then. I told her I loved her, and that love without respect was only pity, and I wanted to offer her more than that eventually. She never touched the money that mattered until she'd built something of her own first. A year later, she was leading financial literacy workshops for young adults at community centers, teaching exactly the lessons she'd learned the hardest way possible. 2 years later, school districts were asking her to write curriculum. I flew back that August, unannounced, and found her at the store where she worked, kneeling to help an elderly customer with her shoes, patient in a way the old Claire never would have bothered to be. She looked up, and for a long moment neither of us moved. "You're shopping at a department store," she finally said. "You haven't bought your own clothes in years. Things change." We had dinner that night in her tiny studio on mismatched plates, the graduation photo she'd kept still hanging crooked on the wall. It was the best meal I'd had in a decade. I didn't come back to save her. I came back to see who she'd become when no one was paying her way anymore. And for the first time in a long time, I liked what I saw. The fortune I'd spent a lifetime building never came close to what sat between us in that small, imperfect room that night. A daughter's respect, earned instead of inherited. And the quiet knowledge that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is let them save themselves.